The cold October wind cut through her threadbare dress as she stood in the middle of Hays City's dusty Main Street, clutching a crumpled piece of paper that meant nothing anymore, because the woman who had promised her work was dead 3 days and buried yesterday. Willa Turner had arrived on the morning stage with exactly $4 to her name, no family to claim her, and a past she could not remember beyond 6 months ago, when she had woken in a charity hospital in St. Louis with a doctor telling her she had been found unconscious near the river. No one had come looking for her. No one had recognized her face on the notices posted around the city. She had simply existed, a ghost of a person, until a woman named Mrs. Henderson had offered her a position as a housekeeper in Kansas. But Mrs. Henderson had taken fever on the journey west, and now Willa stood alone in a town that already looked at her with suspicion. The year was 1874, and Hays City was still rough around the edges despite the railroad bringing more civilization each month. The saloons outnumbered the churches, and single women without protection found themselves in precarious positions quickly. Willa had learned that much in the 3 days since Mrs. Henderson's death. The hotel keeper had given her until tomorrow morning to pay for another night or get out. The other passengers from the stage had scattered to their own destinations. She was alone. "You that girl came in with the Henderson woman?" a voice asked behind her. Willa turned to find a portly man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. His eyes were not unkind, but they held the wariness of a man who had seen too much trouble. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I was to work for her." "Well, she's gone now, and you got no kin here," the sheriff said, stating the obvious. "You got means to support yourself." "I can work," Willa said quickly. "I can cook and clean and sew. I can keep books if needed. I had some education before." She trailed off, not wanting to explain the blank space where her memories should be. The sheriff scratched his jaw. "Problem is, most folks around here don't take kindly to hiring a woman with no references, no family name they recognize. They'll think you're running from something or looking to cause trouble." "I am not running from anything," Willa said, though even as she spoke the words she wondered if they were true. What if she had been running when she ended up in that St. Louis hospital? What if there was some darkness in her past that she could not remember? "Maybe not, but perception's what matters," the sheriff said. "My advice is you get on the next stage east and find yourself a situation in a bigger city where folks don't ask so many questions." "I spent my last money getting here," Willa admitted, hating the way her voice cracked. "I have $4 left," the sheriff sighed. "Then you better find work fast, girl. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house might need help, but she's particular. And the saloons always need girls, but I don't recommend that path." Willa's stomach churned at the implication. She had seen the women who worked in the saloons, their painted faces and hard eyes. "I will try Mrs. Patterson," she said quietly. The sheriff tipped his hat and moved on, and Willa stood there feeling the weight of her situation settle over her like a shroud. No family. No name that meant anything to anyone. No future that she could see beyond the next few desperate days. She had started toward the boarding house when she heard the commotion near the general store. A crowd had gathered, and Willa could hear angry voices rising above the general noise of the street. Curiosity drew her closer, though she knew she should be focused on finding Mrs. Patterson. "I am telling you that order was placed 2 months ago," a deep voice said, and something in the timbre of it made Willa's breath catch. "I have the receipt right here. And I am telling you that I sold those supplies to someone else when you did not show up to claim them." Another man's voice responded, shrill with defensiveness. "I cannot be expected to hold goods indefinitely." Willa edged through the crowd until she could see the 2 men facing off in front of the store. One was thin and balding, wearing a merchant's apron. The other was the largest man Willa had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskins and furs despite the relatively mild autumn weather, and his arms were corded with muscle that strained against his shirt. Everything about him spoke of strength and wildness, of mountains and untamed places. "I was snowed in up north," the big man said, his voice controlled but with an edge of steel beneath. "Could not make it down until the passes cleared. That is not my fault, Clemens, and you know it." "Business is business, Pritchard," the merchant said, though he took a step back as he spoke. "I cannot run a store on promises and excuses." The big man, Pritchard, stared down at the merchant for a long moment. Willa could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands flexed at his sides. Then slowly he nodded. "Fine. You will refund my deposit then." "Well, now that is complicated," Clemens said, his eyes darting away. "There were storage fees, you see, and you will give me back my money," Pritchard said, and this time his voice carried a threat that made several people in the crowd take a step back. "All of it. Right now." Willa found herself holding her breath. The merchant had clearly cheated this man, had sold his goods, and now wanted to keep his deposit as well. It was wrong, and she could see that everyone gathered knew it was wrong, but no one was speaking up. "Actually," Willa heard herself say, her voice carrying clear in the sudden silence, "I believe Kansas law requires that deposits be returned in full if goods are not available as promised, unless there is a written contract stating otherwise." Every eye turned to her, including the startling blue gaze of the mountain man. Willa felt her cheeks heat, but she stood her ground. It was established in the territorial courts and carried over when Kansas became a state. The merchant bears the responsibility for the goods until they are claimed, or until a reasonable time period has passed with proper notification. 2 months is not a reasonable time period, especially considering the winter weather. The merchant's face had gone red. "And who are you to be spouting law at me?" "Someone who can raid," Willa said simply, "and someone who knows that stealing is wrong, whether you do it with a gun or with a store ledger." A few people in the crowd murmured agreement. The sheriff, who had come to see what the commotion was about, stepped forward. "The lady is right, Clemens. You owe Pritchard his deposit back, all of it." The merchant sputtered, but he could see he was beaten. With ill grace, he counted out bills from his cash box and slapped them into Pritchard's outstretched hand. The big man counted them carefully, then nodded once and tucked the money into a pouch at his belt. The crowd began to disperse, and Willa turned to go, but a large hand caught her arm gently. She looked up into the face of the mountain man and felt her heart skip in her chest. Up close, he was even more impressive. His eyes were the blue of a summer sky, startling against his tanned skin. His face was weathered but handsome, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he was not smiling now. "That was foolish," he said bluntly. "Clemens is a vindictive man. You made an enemy just now." "He is a thief," Willa said, lifting her chin. Someone needed to say it. "Why?" Pritchard asked, his head tilting slightly. "What am I to you?" "Nothing," Willa admitted. "But right is right, and I—" She trailed off, not sure how to explain the impulse that had made her speak. "I am sorry if I overstepped." Pritchard studied her for a long moment, his eyes moving over her worn dress, her thin frame, the way she held herself despite her obvious poverty. "You are new in town," he said finally. "Came in on the stage with the Henderson woman." "Yes," Willa said, surprised he knew. "Word travels fast in a small town," Pritchard said. "I heard she died, left you in a bad spot." Willa said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not sound like she was begging for sympathy. You need work, Pritchard continued, and it was not a question. I will find something, Willa said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Pritchard glanced around the street at the people who were still watching with interest, then back at Willa. You know how to cook, how to keep a house? Yes, Willa said cautiously. Can you handle living in the mountains? Real mountains, not these prairie hills. It is isolated. Weeks between seeing another soul sometimes. Willa's heart began to beat faster. Are you offering me a position? I am considering it, Pritchard said. I have a cabin up in the Rockies about a week's ride northwest. I trap and hunt, bring furs down to trade. Been living rough because I have no time to keep things proper. Could use someone to manage the domestic side of things while I work. You are offering to take a strange woman to an isolated cabin in the mountains, Willa said slowly, trying to understand. Do you not see how that sounds? Pritchard's lips twitched, almost but not quite a smile. I see how it sounds. But you just risked making an enemy to help a stranger, and you did it because it was right. That tells me something about your character. And I am not a man who takes advantage of women. You would have your own space, your own privacy. I just need someone who can cook a decent meal and keep the place from falling apart while I am working my trap lines. Willa wanted to ask more questions, wanted to be cautious and careful, but what choice did she have? Stay here and hope Mrs. Patterson would hire her, end up in a saloon or worse. At least this mountain man was being honest about what he wanted, and he had not treated her with anything but respect. When would we leave? She asked. 2 days, Pritchard said. I need to get new supplies ordered and arrange for them to be held by someone more honest than Clemens. Meet me here at dawn the day after tomorrow if you want the position. Bring whatever you have. I will provide everything else you need. He turned and walked away before Willa could respond, his long stride eating up the distance. She stood there, her mind reeling, wondering if she had just been offered salvation or walked into something far more dangerous than staying in Hayes City. That night, in the cramped hotel room that took 2 of her precious remaining dollars, Willa lay awake staring at the ceiling. She tried to remember if she had ever been in mountains, ever known someone like Quinton Pritchard, but her mind was as blank as always. 6 months of memories were all she had, and they were all colored with confusion and fear and the desperate struggle to survive. In the morning, she went to see Mrs. Patterson anyway, more out of a sense of obligation than real hope. The boarding house was neat and well kept, and Mrs. Patterson was a thin woman with sharp eyes who looked Willa up and down with obvious disapproval. Sheriff mentioned you might come by, Mrs. Patterson said, her arms crossed. Looking for work, are you? Yes, madam, Willa said. I can cook and clean and do not need anyone, Mrs. Patterson interrupted. Got 2 girls already who help out just fine. And even if I did, I would not hire someone with no references, no family. For all I know, you are a thief or worse. Willa felt the familiar sting of rejection, but she kept her face impassive. Thank you for your time, madam. She tried 3 other establishments that day with the same result. By evening, she sat in the hotel dining room, eating bread and cheese because it was the cheapest thing on the menu, and faced the reality of her situation. She had no options left except Quinton Pritchard's offer, or the saloon. She thought about the mountain man, about the way he had looked at her with those startling blue eyes. He had been big enough, strong enough to intimidate her if he wanted to, but his touch on her arm had been gentle. His voice had been rough but not cruel. And he had not leered at her or made suggestive comments like so many of the men in town had done over the past few days. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe she was walking into danger. But staying here was danger too, just a different kind. At dawn 2 days later, Willa stood in front of the general store with her carpet bag containing everything she owned in the world. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky pink when Quinton Pritchard rode up leading a second horse, already laden with supplies. He sat astride a huge roan gelding that looked barely big enough to carry his weight, and when he dismounted, the ground seemed to shake slightly. "You came," he said, and there was something like approval in his voice. "I have nothing else," Willa said honestly. "So yes, I came." Pritchard studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. You know how to ride?" "I think so," Willa said. The truth was she had no clear memory of ever riding a horse, but something in her body seemed to know what to do when she thought about it. "We will find out," Pritchard said. He untied a smaller bay mare from the hitching post. "This is Copper. She is gentle, good for a rider learning their seat. I borrowed her from the livery. If you stay on past a trial period, we will figure out a permanent mount." He helped Willa into the saddle with hands that were careful despite their size, then handed up her carpet bag to tie behind the cantle. Once she was settled, he swung up onto his own horse with the ease of long practice. "It is a hard ride," he said, looking at her seriously. "We will push to make good time before the weather turns. You let me know if you need to stop, but understand that the more we stop, the longer we are exposed on the trail." "I will manage," Willa said, gripping the reins. Pritchard nodded once, then turned his horse and started out of town. Willa urged Copper to follow, and as Hayes City fell away behind them, she felt a strange sense of both fear and relief. She was leaving behind the only slightly familiar place she knew, but she was also leaving behind the whispers and the suspicious looks, the constant reminder that she was nobody. Maybe in the mountains, being nobody would matter less. They rode hard that first day, stopping only to water the horses and eat brief meals of dried meat and hard biscuits. Pritchard did not talk much, but he was watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. When they camped that night, he built a fire with practiced efficiency and handed Willa a skillet and provisions. "Show me what you can do," he said simply. Willa's hands worked without her mind quite directing them, and she found herself making biscuits and frying salt pork with coffee boiling on the side. When she handed Pritchard a plate, he ate in silence, then looked up at her with something like surprise. "This is good," he said. "Really good." "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "I do not know," Willa admitted. "I cannot remember anything before 6 months ago." Pritchard's eyebrows rose. "Amnesia." "The doctor said I had taken a blow to the head," Willa said, staring into the fire. "I woke up in a charity hospital with no memory of who I was or where I came from. There was nothing in my pockets, no jewelry, nothing to identify me. The name Willa Turner came from a tag on the dress I was wearing when they found me, but the doctor said it might not even be my real name." She waited for Pritchard to react, to tell her he had changed his mind about taking her on, but he just nodded slowly. "So you really do have no family, no name, no past?" "No," Willa said quietly. "I am sorry I did not tell you before, but people tend to think I am crazy or lying when I explain." "I do not think you are crazy," Pritchard said. He poured himself more coffee and stared up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "I think you have had some hard luck, and you are doing your best with what you have been given. That takes courage." Willa felt an unexpected warmth in her chest at his words. "Thank you," she said softly. They sat in companionable silence for a while, and then Pritchard stood and pointed to a spot on the opposite side of the fire. "You sleep there. I will keep watch first, then wake you for second shift." "You do not have to give me a watch," Willa said. "You are out here now," Pritchard said. "You will learn to do your share, including keeping watch. Wake me if you hear or see anything unusual." He rolled out his bedding and lay down, his rifle within easy reach. Willa did the same, and despite her exhaustion, she found herself staring across the fire at his large form, at the way the firelight played over his features. He had been kind to her in a gruff sort of way, and he had not pressed her about her past. That was more than most people had given her. When he woke her hours later for her watch, his hand on her shoulder was gentle. "Just keep the fire going and stay alert," he murmured. "We are far enough from any settlements that we should not have trouble, but it is always better to be cautious." Willa sat up and nodded, and Pritchard went to his bedroll. Within minutes, his breathing had evened out into sleep, and Willa found herself alone with the darkness and the stars and the soft sounds of the horses shifting nearby. She fed the fire and wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and thought about how strange her life had become. 4 days ago, she had stood in a town with no prospects and no hope. Now she was riding into the mountains with a man she barely knew, heading toward an unknown future. It should have terrified her, but instead, she felt a tiny spark of something she had not felt in a long time: hope. The journey took 8 days instead of 7 because an early storm forced them to shelter in a narrow canyon for most of a day. Pritchard had seen it coming and gotten them to safety before the worst hit, and Willa had been grateful for his knowledge of the land. He taught her as they traveled, pointing out landmarks, showing her how to read the sky for weather, explaining which plants were safe and which were poison. "If something happens to me, you need to be able to get yourself out," he said matter-of-factly when she asked why he was teaching her so much. "The mountains do not forgive ignorance." "You are very cheerful," Willa said dryly, and was rewarded with a brief flash of a grin that transformed his serious face. "Just practical," he said. She learned other things too. She learned that he had been living in the mountains for 5 years, ever since coming back from the war. She learned that he preferred silence to empty chatter, but would answer questions if they were genuine. She learned that he was unfailingly fair in dividing up work and food, never taking more than his share. She learned that he was patient when she struggled with something new, like starting a fire with flint or reading trail sign, but he expected her to remember once he taught her. And she learned that, despite his rough appearance and isolated lifestyle, Quinton Pritchard was a gentleman in the ways that mattered. He never watched her when she bathed in a stream or changed clothes. He never made inappropriate comments or let his eyes linger where they should not. He treated her with respect, as a partner in this enterprise rather than a servant or something worse. By the time they reached his cabin, Willa had begun to relax in his presence, to trust that he meant what he said. The cabin sat in a high valley surrounded by peaks that still had snow on them despite it being October. A stream ran nearby, and stands of pine and aspen provided both shelter and firewood. The cabin itself was larger than Willa had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows. There was a barn for the horses and a smokehouse and a root cellar built into the hillside. "You built all this yourself?" Willa asked as Pritchard helped her down from her horse. "Had some help the first year," Pritchard said. "But mostly yes, it is a good spot. Protected from the worst of the winter storms, good water, plenty of game." He showed her inside, and Willa looked around with interest. The main room held a large stone fireplace, a table with chairs, and a rocking chair near the hearth. There were shelves lined with books and a cupboard for supplies. 2 doors led off the main room, and Pritchard pointed to the one on the right. "That is your room," he said. "It has a bed and a chest for your things. Not fancy, but it is private. My room is on the other side." Willa opened the door and found a small but cozy space with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a chair. There was a window looking out toward the mountains, and someone had even hung curtains. It was more than she had expected, more than she had dared hope for. "This is wonderful," she said, turning back to Pritchard. "Thank you." He looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You will earn it," he said gruffly. "Come on, let me show you the rest." Over the next few hours, Pritchard showed Willa the layout of his homestead. The barn held not just the horses, but also a milk cow and some chickens that a neighbor several miles away had been caring for while he was gone. The root cellar was stocked with potatoes, carrots, and apples. The smokehouse held venison and elk meat. There was even a small garden plot, empty now but ready for planting in the spring. "You are more established than I thought," Willa said as they walked back to the cabin. "I was expecting something more primitive." "I have been here 5 years," Pritchard reminded her. "I may live in the mountains, but I am not a savage. I like comfort as much as the next person." That night, Willa cooked their first real meal in the cabin. She made venison steaks with fried potatoes and biscuits, and she even found some dried apples to stew for dessert. Pritchard ate with obvious appreciation, and when he sat back with his coffee, he looked more relaxed than she had seen him. "This is good," he said. "Real good. It has been a long time since I had a proper meal like this." "Thank you," Willa said, "and thank you for giving me this chance. I know it was a risk, taking on someone like me." Pritchard studied her across the table. "Someone like you. Someone with no past, no references, no proof I am who I say I am," Willa said quietly. "You have been proving who you are every day since we left Hayes City," Pritchard said. "You have not complained, you have worked hard, you have learned fast. That is all the reference I need." Willa felt tears prick her eyes and looked down at her plate to hide them. She had spent 6 months feeling like a ghost, like someone who did not quite exist in the world. To have someone see her, really see her work and her effort and her character, was overwhelming. That night, lying in her small room listening to the wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl, Willa felt something settle in her chest. It was not quite peace, not yet, but it was close. For the first time since waking in that hospital, she felt like maybe she could build something here. Maybe she could become someone real. The days fell into a rhythm. Pritchard left before dawn to check his trap lines, sometimes gone for hours, sometimes for days when he went to more distant areas. Willa managed the homestead, caring for the animals, cooking, cleaning, and learning to do the dozens of tasks required to survive in such an isolated place. She churned butter and made cheese from the cow's milk. She gathered eggs and fed the chickens. She hauled water and chopped wood and mended clothes. Her hands, soft from months of doing nothing in St. Louis, grew calloused and strong. Pritchard proved to be a good teacher when he was around. He showed her how to cure meat properly, how to render fat for soap and candles, how to prepare hides for tanning. He taught her to shoot, starting with a small pistol and working up to a rifle. "You need to be able to defend yourself if someone comes around while I am gone," he said. "Most folks out here are honest, but not all." Willa learned that he had a small network of neighbors scattered through the mountains, other trappers and hermits and people who preferred the isolation. Once a month or so, someone would stop by and Pritchard would trade goods or news. They always treated Willa with careful respect, taking their cues from Pritchard's matter-of-fact introduction of her as his housekeeper. As autumn deepened and winter began to show its teeth, Willa found herself watching Pritchard more than she should. She noticed the way his muscles flexed when he chopped wood, the easy strength with which he hefted supplies. She noticed the way his hair fell forward when he bent over a task, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at something she said. She noticed the sound of his voice, deep and rumbling, and the way her name sounded different when he said it. She was falling in love with him, and she did not know what to do about it. One evening in early November, a blizzard swept down from the mountains without warning. Pritchard had been out checking his nearest trap line when it hit, and Willa stood at the window, straining her eyes against the swirling white, her heart in her throat. He should have been back hours ago. The snow was falling so thick she could barely see the barn. She fed the fire until it roared, lit every lamp in the cabin, and then put on her warmest clothes and went out to the barn to make sure the animals were secure. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet, and the cold bit through her layers like teeth. She got the animals settled and was struggling back to the cabin when she saw a dark shape emerging from the white. Pritchard stumbled through the door moments later, covered in snow, his face red with cold. Willa helped him out of his frozen outer layers, her hands shaking with relief and residual fear. "I was so worried," she said, pulling off his gloves. "You should have been back hours ago." "Got caught farther out than I planned," Pritchard said through chattering teeth. "Had to shelter until I could see well enough to navigate. Did not want to risk getting lost and freezing to death 20 feet from home." Willa pushed him into the chair near the fire and brought him hot coffee laced with whiskey. She rubbed his hands between hers, trying to warm them, and when she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You were really worried," he said, his voice wondering. "Of course I was worried," Willa said, feeling her cheeks heat. She trailed off, not sure how to explain without giving away too much. Pritchard's large hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing over her skin. "Willa," he said softly, and the way he said her name made her breath catch. Then he was pulling his hand back, standing up, moving away from her. "I am sorry," he said, his voice rough. "That was inappropriate. You work for me. I should not." "What if I wanted you to?" Willa heard herself say. Pritchard froze, his back to her. "You do not know what you are saying." "I am saying that I am not a child," Willa said, standing up. "I am a grown woman and I know my own mind. And I know that I think about you more than I should, that I watch for you to come home, that I—" She took a breath. "That I care for you." Pritchard turned slowly, his blue eyes intense. "You have only been here 6 weeks. You do not really know me." "I know that you are honest and fair," Willa said. "I know that you are kind even when you pretend to be gruff. I know that you have treated me with more respect than anyone else in my remembered life. I know that you make me feel safe, and that is not nothing." "I am twice your age," Pritchard said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I am 23 years old," Willa said. "At least that is what the doctor estimated, and you cannot be much past 40. 38, Pritchard admitted. "But still, I brought you here to work for me, not to fall in love with you," Willa said quietly, "because I think it is too late for that." Pritchard stared at her, and she could see the war happening behind his eyes. Then, in 2 long strides, he was across the room and pulling her into his arms. His kiss was fierce and tender all at once, and Willa melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt. He was so big, so strong, but he held her like she was something precious. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. "I have wanted to do that since you stood up for me against Clemens," Pritchard admitted. "You were so fierce, so brave, and I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." "I am not beautiful," Willa protested. "You are to me," Pritchard said simply. He touched her face again, his calloused fingers gentle. "But I need you to be sure about this, Willa. If we go down this road, there is no going back. I am not a man who loves lightly. If I give you my heart, it is yours forever." "Then give it to me," Willa said, looking up into his eyes. "Because mine is already yours." Pritchard kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, and Willa felt like she was finally coming home to a place she had never known she was searching for. They sat up late that night, talking by the fire. Pritchard told her about his life before the mountains, about growing up in Pennsylvania and joining the Union Army and coming back from the war unable to settle into civilization again. He told her about the nightmares and the need for space. the way the mountains had healed something broken in him. "I thought I would live out here alone," he said, his arm around Willa as she leaned against his broad chest. "Thought I was done with people with connections. But then you walked into my life and everything changed." Willa told him what little she remembered, about waking up in the hospital, about the months of struggling to survive in St. Louis, about the desperate hope she had felt when Mrs. Henderson offered her the job. "I felt like I was disappearing," she admitted. "Like without a past, without a family or a name that meant anything, I was not quite real. People looked through me like I was not there." "I see you," Pritchard said, his voice fierce. "I see you, Willa Turner, and you are the most real thing in my world." They slept in separate rooms that night, both of them wanting to do things properly. But when Willa woke the next morning to find the blizzard still raging outside, she felt a joy she could not contain. She was snowed in with the man she loved, in a cabin that had become home, and for the first time in her remembered life, she knew exactly where she belonged. The blizzard lasted 3 days, and in that time, Willa and Pritchard fell deeper in love. They talked for hours, learning each other's thoughts and dreams. They cooked together, Pritchard proving surprisingly skilled at making bread. They read aloud from his collection of books, everything from adventure novels to poetry. They played cards and laughed and stole kisses by the firelight. On the second night, Pritchard asked her to marry him. They were sitting by the fire, Willa curled against his side, when he suddenly shifted and pulled something from his pocket. It was a ring, simple gold, worn smooth with age. "This was my mother's," he said, holding it out to her. "She gave it to me before she died, told me to give it to a woman worthy of wearing it. I never thought I would find that woman, but here you are." Willa stared at the ring, her eyes filling with tears. "Quinton, I know it is fast," Pritchard said quickly. "I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but out here time moves different. Life is harder, shorter sometimes. When you find something good, you hold on to it, and you are the best thing I have ever found." "Yes," Willa said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I will marry you." Pritchard slipped the ring on her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. Then he kissed her, deep and sweet, and Willa felt like her heart would burst with happiness. "I do not have a past I can give you," Willa said when they finally broke apart. "I do not even know if Willa Turner is my real name." "Then we will make you a new name," Pritchard said firmly. "You will be Willa Pritchard, and that is all the name you need. We will build a future together, you and I. We will make a life here in these mountains, and someday our children will play in that meadow, and your past will not matter because your present and your future will be so full." "Our children," Willa said, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Pritchard said, grinning. "So do I." When the blizzard finally cleared, Pritchard rode down to the nearest neighbor, a tough old woman named Martha who lived with her grown son about 10 miles away. He came back with Martha riding behind him, and she spent an hour interrogating Willa about her intentions and her character before finally nodding in approval. "You will do," Martha said gruffly. "Quinton is a good man. You treat him right." "I will," Willa promised. "And he will treat you right, or he will answer to me," Martha said, shooting Pritchard a look that made him raise his hands in surrender. A week later, they rode together to a small settlement 3 days away where a circuit preacher was making his rounds. The preacher married them in a tiny chapel with Martha and her son as witnesses, and Willa became Willa Pritchard in truth. The ride back to the cabin took longer because they stopped often, Pritchard unable to keep from pulling Willa into his arms, from kissing her until they were both breathless. When they finally reached home, he carried her over the threshold despite her laughing protests. And that night, they became husband and wife in every way. Pritchard was gentle with Willa, patient and careful, and when she cried from the overwhelming emotion of it all, he held her close and kissed her tears away. "I love you," he murmured against her hair. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "I love you too," Willa whispered back. "You gave me a name, a home, a future. You gave me myself." "You always had yourself," Pritchard corrected. "I just gave you a place to be it." Winter set in hard after that, the snow piling high around the cabin, the temperatures dropping until the water in the bucket froze overnight. But inside the cabin, Willa had never been warmer. She and Pritchard settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. They worked together during the day, Pritchard tending his trap lines when the weather allowed while Willa managed the homestead. They spent their evenings by the fire, talking or reading or simply sitting in comfortable silence. Pritchard taught Willa to play chess, and she proved a quick study, beating him within a month. He taught her to whittle, and she made her first clumsy attempt at carving a bird. She taught him songs she somehow remembered, her voice sweet in the quiet cabin, and he taught her mountain ballads he had learned from other trappers. They made love often, learning each other's bodies with a joy and enthusiasm that never seemed to dim. Pritchard was always careful with Willa, mindful of his size and strength, but she proved less fragile than he feared. She loved the feel of his muscles under her hands, the way he would catch his breath when she touched him certain ways, the sounds he made in the dark. In January, Willa missed her monthly courses. By February, she was certain she was pregnant. When she told Pritchard, he picked her up and spun her around despite her protests, his face alight with joy. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Willa asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy," Pritchard laughed. "Willa, I am so happy I could burst. I never thought I would have this, a wife, a child, a real family. You have given me everything." As Willa's belly began to swell with their child, Pritchard became even more protective. He no longer went to his distant trap lines, staying close to the cabin in case she needed him. He made her promise not to lift anything heavy or climb to reach high shelves. He rubbed her feet when they swelled and held her hair when morning sickness struck. "You are being ridiculous," Willa told him one day when he refused to let her carry a bucket of water from the stream. "Women have been having babies since the dawn of time. I am not made of glass." "You are carrying my child," Pritchard said firmly. "I am going to take care of you whether you like it or not." "I do like it," Willa admitted, smiling at him, "even when you are being overbearing." Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting in fits and starts. Willa planted her garden with seeds Pritchard had brought back from his fall trip to Hayes City, and she dreamed about teaching their child to tend the plants, to gather eggs from the chickens, to love this wild, beautiful place. In early June, Martha arrived with a younger woman named Susan who had experience as a midwife. They came to stay until the baby was born, and Pritchard was so grateful he nearly cried. "Thank you," he told Martha gruffly. "I have been so worried about her being out here with no one to help if something went wrong." "You are good people," Martha said simply. "We take care of our own out here." Willa went into labor on a warm afternoon with the smell of pine and wildflowers drifting through the open windows. Pritchard paced outside like a caged animal while Martha and Susan tended to Willa. And when he finally heard the thin wail of a newborn, he burst through the door despite Susan's protests. Willa lay exhausted in their bed, her hair damp with sweat, and in her arms was the tiniest, most perfect baby Pritchard had ever seen. He approached slowly, hardly daring to breathe, and when Willa looked up at him with tired joy in her eyes, he felt his heart crack wide open. "It is a boy," she said softly. "A son, Quinton. We have a son." Pritchard sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby. He had a shock of dark hair and his mother's delicate features, and his tiny fist was curled against his chest. "He is perfect," Pritchard said, his voice rough with emotion. "What should we call him?" They had discussed names over the winter, but suddenly all those discussions flew out of Willa's mind. She looked down at her son, at the miracle she and Quinton had created together, and said, "William. After the life we built together. William Pritchard." "William," Pritchard repeated, testing the name. "I like it. William Quinton Pritchard." He reached out one large finger and touched his son's tiny hand, and William's fingers immediately curled around it with surprising strength. Pritchard stared in wonder, and Willa saw tears track down his weathered face. "I never knew I could love something this much," he said quietly. "I never knew it was possible to feel this full." "I know," Willa said, her own tears falling. "I know." Martha and Susan stayed for a week, helping Willa recover and teaching her how to care for the baby. Pritchard was a devoted father from the first moment, taking his turn walking with William when he cried at night, changing his diapers without complaint, staring at him for hours as if he could not quite believe he was real. "You are going to spoil him," Willa teased one evening, watching Quinton rock their son by the fire. "Absolutely I am," Pritchard agreed without shame. "He is my son. I am allowed to spoil him." As summer deepened, they fell into a new rhythm with William at the center of it. Willa nursed him and sang to him and marveled at how quickly he grew. Pritchard carved him a cradle and later a set of wooden animals for him to play with. They took him outside to feel the sun and the wind, and William would stare up at the mountains with serious eyes as if already trying to understand the wild world he had been born into. One evening in late July, Willa and Quinton sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the peaks gold and purple. William slept in his cradle between them, his tiny chest rising and falling with peaceful breaths. Quinton reached over and took Willa's hand, lacing their fingers together. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing this life. It is hard out here, isolated." "You could have stayed in Kansas, found an easier path." Willa looked at him, at this man who had given her everything that mattered, and shook her head. "Never," she said firmly. "You gave me a name when I had none. You gave me a home when I was lost. You gave me love when I felt invisible. How could I ever regret that?" "They said you had no family, no name, no future," Pritchard said, his voice thick with emotion. "But they were wrong. You have a family now, you have my name, and our future is right here together." "Yes," Willa said softly, "it is." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Then William stirred and made a small sound, and Willa lifted him to nurse while Quinton wrapped his arm around them both, protecting his family from the cool evening air. The years that followed were good ones, full of hard work and simple joys. William grew strong and curious, learning to walk by pulling himself up on his father's legs, learning to talk by listening to his parents' voices. When he was 2, Willa became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter with her mother's fine features and her father's blue eyes. They named her Rose, and Quinton was just as besotted with her as he was with William. They added on to the cabin, building another room for the children to share. Pritchard taught William to fish and hunt and track, and the boy proved as capable as his father. Willa taught both children to read and write, and she told them stories about brave pioneers and distant places. They grew up wild and free, comfortable in the mountains, fearless in the face of hardship. When William was 5 and Rose was 3, Willa discovered she was pregnant again. This time she gave birth to twins, boys they named Daniel and Nathan. Pritchard built bunk beds and expanded the barn and walked around with a permanent grin on his face. "4 children," he said one night as they lay in bed listening to the soft sounds of their sleeping family. I never imagined I would be so blessed." "Neither did I," Willa said, curling into his side. "Sometimes I still cannot believe this is my life, that I have you, that I have them, that I have this beautiful home." "Believe it," Pritchard said, kissing her forehead. "You earned every bit of it." The children grew and thrived. William became a skilled hunter like his father, serious and responsible. Rose was fierce and independent, more comfortable in the saddle than anywhere else. The twins were mirror images of each other, always getting into mischief, always making their parents laugh. Pritchard taught all his children to respect the land, to understand the delicate balance of life in the mountains. He taught them to track game without leaving a trace, to read the weather in the clouds, to survive if they ever found themselves lost or alone. Willa taught them kindness and compassion, to see the humanity in everyone they met, to stand up for what was right even when it was hard. The years passed in the rhythm of seasons. Harsh winters when they huddled together by the fire, telling stories and playing games. Springs full of planting and newborn animals and the rush of snowmelt in the streams. Summers of long days and warm nights and the children running wild through the meadows. Autumns of harvest and preparation, the mountains ablaze with color. They were not completely isolated. Martha and her son remained close friends, visiting several times a year. Other neighbors would stop by occasionally, and once a year Pritchard would take the whole family down to the nearest town to trade furs and buy supplies they could not make themselves. The children would stare wide-eyed at the streets and buildings, then be equally relieved when they returned to their mountain home. On their 10th anniversary, Pritchard surprised Willa by taking her to a valley he had found years ago but never shown her. It was a day's ride from their cabin, a hidden place where a waterfall cascaded into a crystal pool and wildflowers carpeted the ground. They left the children with Martha and spent 3 days alone together, making love under the stars and talking about everything and nothing. "I want you to know something," Pritchard said on their last night there, lying with Willa in his arms. "That day in Hayes City when you stood up for me when I first saw you, I knew. I did not know what I knew, but something in my soul recognized you. Like I had been waiting for you without knowing I was waiting." "I felt it too," Willa admitted. "Even scared and desperate as I was, I looked at you and felt safe, and I had not felt safe in so long. You are safe now," Pritchard promised. "You and our children. I will keep you safe for the rest of my life." "I know," Willa said, kissing him. "I have always known." As the children grew older, they began to ask questions about Willa's past. She told them the truth, that she did not remember anything before waking in that St. Louis hospital, that her life truly began when she met their father. "So you do not know if you had a family before?" William asked when he was 12, his young face serious. "No," Willa said honestly. "But it does not matter. You are my family. You and your father and your sister and brothers. You are all the family I need." "What if someone came looking for you?" Rose asked, ever practical at 10. "What if you had people who missed you?" "Then they would have found me by now," Willa said. "But honestly, my darling, I do not think there was anyone. I think I was alone, and that is why losing my memory did not take away anything important, because I had nothing important to lose until I found your father." The children seemed satisfied with this answer, and the topic was dropped. But Pritchard knew that Willa still sometimes wondered, still had moments when she would stare off into the distance with a faraway look in her eyes. He would come up behind her at those times and wrap his arms around her, grounding her in the present, reminding her that whatever she might have lost in the past, she had everything that mattered right here. When William turned 16, a trader passing through brought news that made Pritchard's blood run cold. There had been a woman asking questions in Hayes City, looking for someone matching Willa's description. The trader did not know much more, but he thought the woman had said something about a missing sister. Pritchard told Willa that night after the children were in bed. He watched her face carefully, trying to gauge her reaction. "Someone is looking for me," Willa said slowly. "After all these years." "Maybe," Pritchard said. "Could be nothing. Could be a coincidence, but I thought you should know." Willa was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Then she looked up at Quinton, and her eyes were clear and certain. "I am not going," she said firmly. "I do not know who this woman is or what she wants, but my life is here. My family is here. I am not leaving." "I would never ask you to leave," Pritchard said, relief flooding through him. "But if you wanted to find out, if you wanted answers, I would understand." "I have all the answers I need," Willa said. She stood and came to him, cupping his bearded face in her hands. "You are my answer, Quinton Pritchard. You and our children. Maybe I had a life before, maybe I had a family, but they did not come looking for me when it mattered. They did not find me when I was lost and alone. You did that. You gave me a life when I had none. I am not giving that up for a maybe." Pritchard pulled her into his lap and held her tight. "I love you," he said roughly. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you, and I will love you until the day I die." "And I love you," Willa whispered. "Always." They heard nothing more about the woman asking questions, and life went on. William grew into a man, tall and strong like his father. At 19, he married a girl from a neighboring homestead, and Pritchard gave them land to build their own cabin. Rose, at 17, surprised everyone by announcing she wanted to be a teacher and convinced her parents to let her go to Denver for training. The twins, 15 and inseparable, showed signs of following their father into the trapping and hunting business. Willa and Quinton watched their children grow and begin their own lives with pride and a touch of melancholy. The cabin was quieter now, and they found themselves alone together more often, rediscovering each other in the spaces their children had left behind. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sun set, Willa leaned her head on Quinton's shoulder and sighed contentedly. They were both graying now, lines carved deeper in their faces by years of weather and work and laughter, but Quinton still looked at Willa like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Willa asked. "When you offered me the job." "I remember thinking you were either very brave or very desperate," Quinton said with a smile. "You told me I would have my own space, my own privacy," Willa continued. "You promised you were not the kind of man who would take advantage." "I meant it," Quinton said. "I know you did," Willa said. "And you kept that promise right up until I told you I loved you. You never pushed, never demanded. You waited for me to choose you." "You were worth waiting for," Quinton said simply. "You still are." Willa turned to look at him, this mountain of a man who had shown her what love really meant. "They said I had no family, no name, no future," she said softly. "But you gave me all three. You gave me the Pritchard name. You gave me your family. And you built me a future that is more beautiful than anything I could have imagined." "We built it together," Quinton corrected. "You think I did not need you just as much. I was half a man when I met you, Willa. Alive but not really living. You made me whole again. You gave me a reason to come home at night, a reason to plan for tomorrow. You gave me love when I thought I was done with loving." They sat together as the stars emerged, holding hands like they had done countless times over the past 20 years. The mountains rose around them, solid and eternal, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, and in the barn, the animals settled for the night. It was home, real and solid, and earned through years of work and love and commitment. "What do you think happened to that woman?" Willa asked suddenly. "The one who was asking about me. Does it matter?" Quinton asked. Willa thought about it. "No," she said finally. "I suppose it does not. Whatever life I might have had before, this is the life I chose. This is the life I want." "Good," Quinton said, squeezing her hand, "because I plan on keeping you for at least another 50 years. Willa laughed, the sound carrying across the valley. "Only 50, I was hoping for more, greedy woman," Quinton teased, pulling her close. "Fine, forever then. I will keep you forever." "That sounds perfect," Willa said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The years continued to roll by. Rose came home from Denver with a teaching certificate and a fiancé, a doctor who had fallen in love with her fierce independence and sharp mind. They married in the meadow near the cabin, and Willa cried happy tears while Quinton gave his daughter away. William and his wife had their first child, making Willa and Quinton grandparents, and there was nothing quite like watching this big, gruff man cradle a tiny baby with infinite gentleness. The twins took over most of the trapping business as Quinton grew older, though he still insisted on checking his nearest lines. He and Willa spent more time together, taking long walks through the mountains, fishing in the streams, simply sitting together in comfortable silence. Their love had deepened over the years, moving from passion to partnership to something almost sacred. On their 25th anniversary, their children threw them a party. William and his family came. Rose and her husband traveled up from the town where they now lived, and the twins, still living nearby, organized everything. Martha, ancient now but still sharp as ever, made the journey one more time. Friends and neighbors from across the mountains gathered to celebrate the couple who had built such a strong life together. Quinton stood to give a toast, and the room fell silent. 25 years ago, he said, his voice carrying despite his age, I met a woman in Hayes City who was brave enough to speak up for a stranger. I did not know then that she would become my whole world. I did not know that she would give me the greatest gifts of my life, these children, these grandchildren, this home we have built together. He turned to Willa, his blue eyes still as clear and loving as the day they met. They said you had nothing, Willa. No family, no name, no future. But they were wrong. You had everything you needed inside you. You had courage and strength and love enough to fill all these mountains. I just gave you a place to let it shine. Willa stood and went to him, and he pulled her into his arms. And you gave me a reason to let it shine, she said, her voice breaking. You saw me when I was invisible. You valued me when I felt worthless. You loved me when I did not know how to love myself. Everything good in my life comes from the day you asked me if I wanted a job. Best decision I ever made, Quinton said, kissing her forehead. The party went late into the night, full of laughter and music and stories. The children told embarrassing tales about their parents. Friends shared memories of the early days, and Willa and Quinton danced slowly by firelight, holding each other close. When everyone had finally gone home or settled into sleeping spots around the cabin and barn, Willa and Quinton lay in their bed, exhausted but happy. This is what they meant, Willa said softly in the darkness. What who meant? Quinton asked sleepily. When people talk about a life well lived, Willa said, this is it. Not wealth or fame or grand adventures, just this. Love and family and a home you built with your own hands, watching your children grow and thrive. Growing old with someone who still makes your heart skip. You still make my heart skip, Quinton murmured, pulling her closer. Every single day. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and if their sleep was not as deep as it once was, if their bodies ached in ways they had not when they were young, it did not matter. They had each other, and that was enough. The mountains continued their eternal rhythm around them. Snow fell and melted, seasons turned, years passed. Quinton's hair went fully white, though his strength remained impressive. Willa developed lines around her eyes from years of smiling, and her hands were gnarled from decades of work, but Quinton still held them like they were precious. Their children had children, and those children began to have children of their own. The Pritchard name spread through the mountains, and people knew them as good folk, honest and hardworking and kind. On a summer evening 30 years after their wedding, Willa and Quinton sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. They were 75 and 70 now, old by any standard, but still sharp-minded and reasonably healthy. They had been talking about maybe going to visit Rose in town, about the new foal in the barn, about nothing and everything. As the sun set, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose, Quinton suddenly squeezed Willa's hand. "I need to tell you something," he said seriously. Willa looked at him, her heart skipping with concern. "What is it?" "I am not afraid of dying," Quinton said quietly. "When my time comes, I will be ready, but I am afraid of leaving you alone. I'm afraid you will think that I am abandoning you the way everyone else in your life did." Willa felt tears spring to her eyes. "Quinton, you could never abandon me. You have been with me every day for 3 decades. You have given me more love in that time than most people get in 3 lifetimes. Promise me something," Quinton said urgently. "Promise me that when I am gone, you will not forget how much you were loved. Promise me you will remember that you mattered, that you had value, that you were everything to me." "I promise," Willa said, her voice breaking, "but you have to promise me something too. Promise me that when your time comes, you will go peacefully, knowing that you saved my life in every way a person can be saved. You gave me myself, Quinton. You gave me a life worth living." "I promise," Quinton said, pulling her close. "Though I plan on staying around to bother you for many more years yet." "Good," Willa said, laughing through her tears, "because I am not done with you yet, old man." They sat together until the stars came out, and then Quinton helped Willa up and they went inside, moving slowly but still hand in hand. They checked the fire, banked it for the night, and went to their bed. And they fell asleep wrapped around each other, the way they had done for 30 years, the way they would do for all the years remaining to them. Quinton lived another 15 years, making it to 85 before his heart finally gave out one winter morning. He died peacefully in his sleep with Willa beside him, and when she woke to find him gone, she did not scream or wail. Instead, she held his hand and told him one more time that she loved him, that he had been everything, that she would carry him in her heart forever. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half the territory. Their 4 children came with their families, and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled the cabin and spilled out into the yard. Friends and neighbors came from miles around to pay their respects to the mountain man who had been a legend in these parts, known for his fairness and his skill and his deep love for his wife. After everyone had left, after the last condolences had been offered and the last casserole had been delivered, Willa stood alone in the cabin that had been her home for 45 years. She looked around at the life she and Quinton had built together, and instead of feeling empty, she felt full. Full of memories, full of love, full of gratitude for every single day she had been given with him. She lived on in the cabin for 3 more years, tended by her children and grandchildren who made sure she was never truly alone. She told stories about Quinton, about their early days, about how he had given a woman with nothing a name and a future. She watched her great-great-grandchildren play in the meadow and thought about how one act of kindness, one man choosing to see her value, had created all of this. On a spring morning when the wildflowers were just beginning to bloom, Willa died in her sleep. She was 86 years old, and her last thoughts were of a tall man with blue eyes and long dark hair who had looked at her across a dusty Kansas street and seen not a woman with no past, but a woman with infinite potential for a future. They buried her next to Quinton in the spot they had chosen years before, a rise overlooking the valley with a view of the mountains they had both loved. The entire family gathered once more, now spread across 3 states, but all coming home to say goodbye to the woman who had been the heart of their clan. William, now in his 60s and still strong, stood to speak. "My mother used to tell us that she did not remember her life before she met our father," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "She said her real life started that day in Hayes City when a mountain man offered her a job. But I think she was wrong about one thing. She always said he gave her a life. But the truth is they gave life to each other. He was half wild when he met her, more comfortable with animals than people. She gentled him, made him whole, and she was lost, adrift in the world. He anchored her, gave her purpose." He looked down at the 2 graves, side by side. "They saved each other, and in doing so they created all of us. Every person here exists because 2 people chose to love each other despite all the reasons they could have walked away. That is their legacy. Not just these mountains or this cabin or even the Pritchard name. Their legacy is love, the kind of love that builds futures and creates families and lasts beyond death itself." There were tears and there was laughter, and when everyone finally left, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting them in the colors Willa and Quinton had watched together for so many years. The cabin still stands, maintained now by great-grandchildren who understand what it represents. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind is just right, people say you can feel them there still, the mountain man and the woman with no past, together forever in the place where they built their future, where they proved that the things that matter most are not the things you are born with, but the things you choose to create with the people you love. Their story became legend in those mountains, passed down through generations. The tale of how Quinton Pritchard gave Willa Turner his name and built her a future, but really, how they built that future together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. And in the end, that was the greatest gift of all, not the rescue, not the provision, but the partnership. 2 people who had been broken in different ways finding each other and becoming whole, creating something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of what they had lost. The last thing Willa had written in a journal she kept for her descendants was this: "They said I had no family, no name, no future. They were wrong. I always had the potential for all of those things. I just needed someone to believe in me enough to let me reach for them. Quinton was that someone. And in return, I gave him something he needed just as badly, a reason to stop running from the world and start living in it again. We saved each other. That is what real love does." And so their story ends not with sadness but with triumph, not with loss but with legacy, not with an ending but with a beginning that continued through every child and grandchild and great-grandchild who carried their blood and their names and their understanding that love, real love, is what builds futures. The kind of love that sees past circumstance and history to the person underneath. The kind of love that offers not rescue but partnership, not charity but respect, not pity but genuine affection. The kind of love that says, "You are worthy exactly as you are, and together we can build something neither of us could build alone." That was the future Quinton Pritchard built when he gave Willa Turner his name. And that was the future Willa built when she said yes to a mountain man who saw her when she felt invisible. Together, they created something that lasted far beyond their years, far beyond those mountains, far beyond even death itself. They created a love story for the ages, simple and true and real. And in a wild, hard land where survival was difficult and happiness was rare, they found both together and held on to them until the very end. Their love proved that it does not matter where you come from or what you have lost. What matters is who you choose to become, who you choose to love, and what you choose to build with the time you are given. Willa and Quinton chose well, and the mountains remember them still.